The service manager at Hartwell Automotive didn't even look up from his clipboard when he said it. "Mr. Keane, I'll be straight with you. The transmission's gone. Rebuild's going to run you close to $18,000. At that mileage, honestly, you're better off selling it for parts and putting that money towards something new." He said it the way people say things they've said 100 times before. Flat. Final. Like the conversation was already over. Roland Keane stood there on the polished showroom floor, the kind of floor that reflected the overhead lights so cleanly it almost hurt to look at, and he nodded slowly. Not because he agreed, because he'd learned a long time ago that when someone in a pressed shirt decides they already know the answer, there's no point arguing in their building. He drove the '94 BMW 5 Series home on the highway with the windows down, the transmission slipping between second and third the way it had been for the past 3 weeks, and he thought about what the manager had said. 18,000. Or nothing. The car had been his father's. Not in a sentimental, kept in the garage, polished on Sundays kind of way. His father had driven it to work every day for 11 years, to the mill in Barrie where he'd spent most of his adult life. When he passed 2 winters ago, Roland had inherited it, the house on Penetang Street, and a stack of unpaid bills that took 8 months to sort through. He kept the car, he let the house go. He pulled into the driveway of the rental on Essa Road just as the sun was getting low. The house was small, the kind of small that felt smaller in winter, but the garage was decent, and that was the part that mattered. His daughter, Emmy, was sitting on the front steps with her backpack still on, eating an apple and reading something on her phone. She was 9. She still wore her backpack sometimes even when she had nowhere to be. Roland had stopped questioning it. "The dealership said no?" she asked without looking up. "The dealership said 18,000. Emmy lowered her phone. "That's more than you make in 3 months." "I know what I make, bud." She went back to her screen. "So what are you going to do?" Roland looked at the car sitting in the driveway. The paint was faded at the roof. There was a small rust bubble above the rear wheel well that he'd been meaning to treat for a year. But the body was straight, the interior was clean, and underneath all that, the engine itself ran like a watch. "I'm going to figure it out," he said. That was a Saturday. By Monday morning, he'd pulled the gearbox. Roland had been working on cars since he was 14 years old. In the driveway of his parents' house on a street in Angus, where half the neighbors were mechanics or knew one. He hadn't gone to college for it. He hadn't gone to college for anything, a fact that had embarrassed him once, and that he'd long since stopped thinking about. He'd learned by doing, by asking, by taking things apart in ways that sometimes couldn't be put back together, and then figuring out why. He'd worked at 3 different shops over the years. The last one, a mid-size operation in Barrie that serviced fleet vehicles for a couple of municipal contracts, let him go 18 months ago when the owner's son-in-law came back from Alberta and needed a job. Roland had been there 9 years. He got 2 weeks severance and a handshake. Since then, he'd been doing private work out of his garage. Word of mouth, mostly. Neighbors, people from Emmy's school, the occasional Kijiji ad. It paid enough to keep the lights on. Not enough for much else. He didn't say any of that to people. There was nothing to say. He just worked. The BMW's gearbox came out on Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, he had it on the bench and was going through it section by section the way he always did, methodically, without hurrying, taking notes in the small notebook he kept beside his toolbox. He'd been keeping notebooks like that for 20 years. Emmy called them his car diaries. He called them how I don't forget things. It was in the 3rd notebook entry that something stopped him. He'd been looking at the valve body, the hydraulic control unit that regulates which gear gets selected, when he noticed something that didn't belong. A hairline fracture, barely visible, running along the edge of the pressure regulator bore. Not broken, not failed, just compromised enough that under certain loads, at certain temperatures, the hydraulic pressure would drop just enough to cause the transmission to slip. It was not an $18,000 problem. He sat back on his stool and looked at it for a long time. The part he needed was a replacement valve body. Rebuilt, it would run him about $400. Installation, maybe a day's work. The total cost, including fluid and a new filter, would be under $600. Hartwell Automotive had run a diagnostic scan on the car. The scan had flagged general transmission fault codes because that's exactly where the codes go when hydraulic pressure drops. The code said transmission. The diagnostic said transmission. Nobody had gone further than that because nobody needed to, or because nobody thought it was worth the time, or because an $18,000 rebuild was a much better afternoon than a $600 repair. Roland didn't know which one it was. He suspected it didn't matter. He ordered the part that evening. Emmy came into the garage after school on Wednesday and sat on the overturned milk crate she'd claimed as her spot. She'd been doing that since she was 6, sitting in the corner while he worked, sometimes reading, sometimes doing homework, sometimes just watching. She didn't always talk. He didn't always need her to. It was enough that she was there. Her mother had died when Emmy was 4. Stomach cancer, caught late, progressed fast. Roland didn't talk about it much. Not because it still broke him open the way it had in the beginning, but because there wasn't anything useful to say. Ruthann had been gone for 5 years, and he had learned, slowly and not gracefully, how to be both parents at once. He wasn't always good at it. Emmy had told him, plainly on more than one occasion, that he was better at cars than at feelings. He thought that was fair. The dealership was wrong, Emmy said, not looking up from her book. They weren't wrong about the codes, Roland said. The codes said transmission. The machine read what it was programmed to read, but the machine was wrong. The machine told the truth. The people stopped before they found it. Emmy considered that. That's worse, isn't it? If the machine was wrong, you could fix the machine. But if the people just stopped looking, then that's a people problem, Roland said. She nodded like she was filing it away. The valve body arrived Thursday morning. Roland installed it Thursday afternoon. By 4 o'clock he had the gearbox back in, the fluid filled, the undercarriage clean. At 4:15 he backed the car out of the garage and drove it down Essa Road to the highway and back, shifting through every gear twice, and the transmission moved the way it was supposed to move, smooth and solid and certain, the way his father had driven it for 11 years. He sat in the driveway with the engine running for a few minutes, not doing anything, just listening. $612. 3 days of work. $18,000, the man at Hartwell had said. He didn't go back to Hartwell Automotive. That wasn't the kind of man he was. He fixed his car, he paid his bills, and he let other people's bad advice stay in the past where it belonged. He posted a short write-up about the repair on a BMW enthusiast forum he'd been a member of for years, not as a complaint, just as a technical note. He described the symptom, the incorrect diagnosis, the actual fault, and the fix. He included photos of the cracked valve body. He wrote it the way he wrote his notebooks, plainly, without drama. It got more attention than he expected. Within 2 days, the post had been shared several times. People were tagging others, leaving comments, asking questions. Someone in Sudbury messaged him privately to say their dealer had told them the same thing about their vehicle. Same codes, same recommendation, and that they'd almost signed the paperwork for a new car before they saw his post. He answered every message. That was something Ruthann had always said about him, that he answered. Not quickly, sometimes, but he answered. The following week, a woman called him. Her name was Patricia Atchison. She introduced herself carefully, the way people do when they're not sure how to explain what they want. She said she'd found his forum post through a friend who'd tagged her. She said her late husband had owned a 1988 Porsche 911, and that 3 different dealers and 2 independent shops had told her it needed a full transmission rebuild or replacement, and that the quotes ranged from $14,000 to $22,000, and that every single one of them had arrived at that conclusion by plugging in a diagnostic scanner and reading what came out. My husband drove that car for 18 years, she said. I can't just sell it. Roland asked her what the car was doing. She described it. He asked follow-up questions. She answered them carefully, and he could tell she'd been paying attention. The way people who love something learn to pay attention to its sounds and moods and small complaints. "Has anyone listened to it?" Roland asked. There was a pause on her end. "I'm sorry?" "Has anyone actually listened to the car? Not with a scanner. Just listened." Another pause. "I don't know what that means. Can you bring it to me?" Roland said. Patricia Atchison arrived on a Saturday morning in a flatbed truck that a neighbor had arranged for her. She was in her mid-60s, small and composed, wearing a wool coat that was slightly too large for her. She watched them unload the Porsche from the flatbed, the way you watch someone carry something irreplaceable. The car was silver, old silver, not metallic, the kind of color that looks almost gray in the shade and then catches light a certain way and becomes something else entirely. It was filthy from sitting, and there were leaves packed into the front grille, but the body was intact. Emmy was watching from the doorway. Roland walked around the car once without touching it. Then he crouched by the driver's side rear wheel well for a moment. Then he stood up and asked Patricia to pop the rear lid. The 911's engine was in the back. Had been since the first one rolled out of Stuttgart. Roland knew this the way he knew which end of a wrench to hold, automatically, before thinking, as fact. The lid went up, and he stood there looking at the flat six and listening to what the car was telling him without the car moving at all. There are things you can hear in a machine that a computer cannot measure, not because the computer isn't sophisticated enough, but because the measurement requires something the computer doesn't have. A frame of reference built from years of being wrong and right in equal parts and knowing the difference. He asked Patricia to start the car. She did. It turned over without complaint, idled rough for a moment, then settled into something that wasn't right but wasn't catastrophic either. He stood beside the car with his eyes closed for about 45 seconds. Emmy, from the doorway, watched him do it. She'd seen it before. She knew what it meant. It meant he was listening past the obvious to whatever was underneath. He opened his eyes. "Do you have the service records?" he asked Patricia. "My husband kept everything," she said. "It's all in a binder in the car." He spent 20 minutes with the binder. Then he spent another 45 minutes underneath the car on his creeper, moving slowly, with a work light and his hands and his attention. He came out, sat up, and wrote something in his notebook. "The gearbox is," he said. Patricia went very still. "The differential carrier bearing is worn. When you're under load in certain RPM ranges, it's causing a vibration that the drivetrain interprets as a slip. The diagnostic codes are consistent with transmission problems because that's where the vibration registers in the system. But the transmission is fine." He showed her the notebook entry. He explained it the way he always explained things, assuming the person in front of him was intelligent and just needed the information. "The part is about the size of a deck of cards," he said. "It's not cheap, it's a Porsche, and anything Porsche that isn't cheap gets more expensive. But we're talking somewhere around $2,000, parts and labor." Not 22. Patricia Atchison sat down on the milk crate in the corner of his garage, the one that was Emmy's spot. She sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap. "3 shops," she said. "3 shops told me to rebuild it or sell it." "I know. Why didn't they?" "Because the scanner said transmission and they stopped there." Roland kept his voice even. "The scanner told the truth. The fault codes were real. But fault codes tell you where the symptom ended up, not where it started." She looked at the car. "My husband would have known that, probably. He used to say that machines talk if you know how to listen." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what he meant until right now." Roland didn't say anything. He wrote the repair estimate in his notebook, tore the page out, and handed it to her. Emmy appeared beside him at some point, he wasn't sure exactly when, and stood there looking at Patricia Atchison sitting on her milk crate with the repair estimate in her hands. "He fixed our car too," Emmy said. "Everyone said it was broken. He found the real problem." Patricia looked at her. "How old are you?" 9. You must learn a lot, spending time in here. I learned that people stop too early, Emmy said, before they get to the actual answer. Roland ordered the part on Monday. It arrived Wednesday. The repair took most of Thursday, which was a longer job than it sounded, because getting to the differential on an air-cooled 911 requires patience and an intimate familiarity with the geometry of things packed in very little space. He did not rush it. He never rushed anything he couldn't undo. Patricia came back Friday afternoon. Roland had her drive it down Essa Road and back while he followed in his truck. He watched the car move and listened to what he could hear from 30 meters behind it, which was not much, but was something. When she pulled back into his driveway, she got out and stood beside the car for a moment without saying anything. "How does it feel?" Roland asked. "Like his," she said. He gave her the invoice. She looked at it. She paid it without negotiating, which he hadn't expected, and then she stood by the car a little longer and he let her stand there. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure, why are you working out of a garage on Essa Road?" She said it without unkindness, just curiosity, direct and genuine. "You're clearly—" She gestured at the car, at the garage, at some larger thing she seemed to be trying to name. "Why aren't you somewhere bigger?" Roland thought about that. He thought about the shop in Barrie, and the 9 years, and the 2 weeks severance. He thought about the pressed shirt manager at Hartwell Automotive. He thought about the 3 shops that had looked at Patricia Atchison's car and seen a number instead of a problem. "Because this is where I can do the work the way I want to do it," he said. She nodded like that was a complete answer. He supposed it was. He didn't find out until 2 weeks later that Patricia Atchison was on the board of directors of a regional automotive industry association. He found out because she called him and told him and asked if he would consider speaking at their spring conference in Orillia about diagnostic methodology and what she called, in her careful way, the gap between tool output and mechanical truth. He said he'd think about it. He meant it as a polite decline. Emmy found out that evening, the way she always found out things, by being present in rooms where adults talked. "You should go," she said. "It's not really my kind of thing." "What kind of thing is it?" "Rooms full of people in suits talking about cars they've never actually touched." "Mom would have told you to go," Emmy said. He looked at her. She looked back at him, steady and certain, the way she sometimes was, with a certainty that seemed too settled for a 9-year-old and that he suspected was something she'd simply been born with. "She would have said you already know more than everyone in the room," Emmy said. "She would have said that's exactly why you should be in the room." Roland was quiet for a moment. He thought about Ruth Ann. He thought about the way she used to stand in the kitchen doorway watching him in the garage, and how she'd told him once that the most frustrating thing about him was that he never seemed to understand what he actually was. "What are you?" Then, he'd asked her. She'd shrugged. "A person who knows things," she'd said. "There are fewer of them than you think." He called Patricia Atchison back on Thursday. The conference was held in mid-April at a hotel conference center in Orillia that smelled like carpet cleaner and the kind of coffee that's been sitting too long. Roland wore his good flannel shirt, which Emmy had ironed for him that morning without being asked. She'd also suggested he get a haircut, which he'd done on Wednesday, and which she'd evaluated with the neutral expression of someone doing quality control. "Better," she'd said. There were about 60 people in the room. Most of them were in suits or blazers. Several of them worked for dealership groups. 2 were from an automotive training college. There was a man from a provincial licensing body who Roland could tell within 30 seconds had never actually repaired a vehicle in his professional life. Roland had brought his notebook. He spoke for about 35 minutes. He didn't have slides. He hadn't prepared slides because the idea of putting his notebook entries on a slideshow had seemed wrong in a way he couldn't fully explain. He just talked. He described the BMW, the Porsche, several other vehicles he'd worked on over the years, where a scanner result had led a shop in the wrong direction. He talked about the difference between diagnostic output and diagnostic understanding. He talked about what happens when you listen to a machine instead of just reading about it. He wasn't a natural public speaker. He knew that. He paused too long sometimes and didn't always signal when he was moving from one point to another. But the room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when people are actually paying attention, which is a different quiet than the polite kind. Afterward, a man in his 50s came up to him. He introduced himself as Brendan Okafor, which Roland heard as both a first name and something formal attached to a title he didn't catch because there was noise in the room. "I run a group of 12 shops across the province," Brendan said. He had a handshake that meant something. "I've been trying to articulate what you just described for about 4 years. I haven't been able to do it that clearly." "It's not complicated," Roland said. "The fact that you think it's not complicated is exactly the problem with how we train people," Brendan said, and he said it with a kind of frustrated admiration that Roland recognized as genuine. They talked for 20 minutes in the corner of the room. Brendan asked questions and Roland answered them. Brendan asked if Roland would be interested in a consulting arrangement, helping develop diagnostic training materials, reviewing cases from his shops where scanner results weren't lining up with what technicians were finding on the bench. Roland said he'd think about it. He drove home to Barrie with the windows down, the same highway, the same engine sound, the car his father had driven for 11 years running the way it should. Emmy was up when he got home, which was past her bedtime, sitting at the kitchen table with a book. "How was it?" she asked. "All right, just all right?" "A man offered me work," Roland said. "Real work. The kind that might actually pay." Emmy put down her book. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for situations where she was deciding whether or not to say what she was thinking. She said it. "Dad, you've been thinking for 18 months, since the shop let you go. You fix everyone's cars. You solve the problems no one else can find. You charge less than you should, and then you come back here and say you'll think about it." She picked up her book again. "Maybe thinking is the problem." Roland stood in his kitchen doorway for a moment. "When did you get this opinionated?" "I've always been this opinionated," Emmy said. "You've just been too busy thinking to notice." He laughed. He didn't laugh often enough, and he knew it, and, when he did, it surprised him a little, like finding something in a coat pocket he'd forgotten about. He called Brendan Okafor the next morning. It took 3 months to work out the details. Roland started with 2 days a week, reviewing cases, writing up methodology notes, occasionally going on site to one of Brendan's shops when a diagnosis had gone sideways and the technicians couldn't find the thread. He charged a fair rate, not an inflated one, and Brendan paid it without comment. By the end of summer, it was 4 days a week. By fall, there was a conversation about something more permanent. He kept the garage on Essa Road. He still took private work, because there were cars that needed someone to actually listen to them and not just plug in a machine, and he was not going to stop being the person who did that. He kept his notebook beside his toolbox. He kept the BMW in the driveway, the paint still faded at the roof, the rust bubble still there above the rear wheel well, still meaning to treat it, still not getting around to it. Emmy started grade 5 in September. She told her teacher her father was an automotive diagnostician, which was not a word Roland had ever used to describe himself, but which he supposed was accurate enough. In November, Patricia Atchison sent him a note in the mail, an actual letter on actual paper. The kind of thing that doesn't happen very often anymore. She said she'd been driving the Porsche regularly since the repair, that it was running the way it always had, that she'd taken it out on the highway last Sunday morning and held it at 110 for about 20 minutes just because she could. She wrote, "My husband used to say that the right mechanic treats a car like it has a history worth understanding. I finally found one." Roland read the letter twice, then put it in his notebook between 2 pages of diagnostic notes. The same notebook he'd been writing in since before Emmy was born, the one she called his car diary, the one he called How I Don't Forget Things. He didn't write a response right away. He thought about what to say. He thought about his father driving this same car to the mill in Barry for 11 years. He thought about the man at Hartwell who hadn't looked up from his clipboard. He thought about Emmy on the milk crate, watching. He thought about what Ruth Ann had said years ago in the kitchen doorway, a person who knows things. There are fewer of them than you think. He wrote back on a Thursday evening, with Emmy doing homework at the kitchen table and the garage quiet and the car in the driveway. He wrote, "Thank you for trusting me with it. Some things are worth fixing properly. I'm glad we didn't stop early." He sealed it and put it by the door to mail in the morning. Emmy looked up from her homework. "What are you doing?" "Writing a letter." She stared at him. Like on paper. Like on paper. She considered this with the gravity of someone encountering a genuinely foreign custom. "Does anyone still do that?" "Apparently," Roland said. "Some of us do." She smiled at that, a small and sideways smile that was so much like her mother's that it stopped him for just a moment, the way it still did sometimes, without warning, in ordinary rooms, in ordinary light. He put his pen down. He looked at his daughter. She'd already gone back to her homework, head bent over the page, pencil moving, perfectly contained in whatever she was thinking about. He thought, "I don't know what I'm doing most of the time. But I know how to find the real problem, and I know when to stay in the room until I've found it." That was enough. Most days, that was more than enough.